Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle and into the massive docking bay of Zenith Prime Station. His heart pounded with excitement and nervousness. At 22 years old, he was the youngest member of Earth's diplomatic team, fresh from the academy with perfect scores and high hopes. The station stretched out before him like a small city floating in space, with corridors branching off in every direction and aliens of dozens of species moving about their business. The air smelled strange, a mixture of unfamiliar scents that his nose couldn't quite identify. Jake adjusted his diplomatic uniform and followed the other humans toward the main assembly hall, where the welcome ceremony would take place. His supervisor, Claire Patterson, walked ahead of him with the rest of the senior diplomats. She hadn't spoken much to Jake during the journey, and he got the feeling she wasn't thrilled about having such a young and inexperienced member on her team. The assembly hall was enormous, with a ceiling that curved high above like a cathedral. Delegates from various species stood in groups, their conversations creating a low buzz of different languages and sounds. Jake recognized some species from his studies: the tall, elegant Velcrin with their silver skin and flowing robes, the stocky Qualith with their forearms and rocky hide, the insectoid Hytherin clicking and chirping to each other, and the glowing Meridians who seemed to float slightly above the ground. When the ceremony began, Jake's nerves got the better of him. As the Velcrin ambassador approached their group, Jake did what felt natural. He smiled broadly and extended his hand for a handshake, just like he'd done 1,000 times back on Earth. The Velcrin ambassador stopped dead in his tracks, his silver face twisting in what Jake would later learn was disgust. The ambassador's attendants gasped and pulled their leader back as if Jake had tried to strike him. "Offensive," the Velcrin ambassador hissed in accented English. "Physical contact before formal introduction is deeply offensive." Jake's face burned red. He stammered an apology, but the damage was done. The other species in the hall had seen everything. They whispered among themselves, and Jake caught words in various languages that he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear from the tone. Claire shot him a look that could freeze fire. The ceremony continued, but Jake felt like he was moving through fog. Every species they met seemed to look at him with barely concealed disdain or pity. When the formal introductions finally ended, Claire pulled him aside in a quiet corridor. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I was just trying to be friendly," Jake said weakly. "This isn't Earth, Morrison. Every species has different customs, different rules, different ways of showing respect. That's why we have protocols. That's why we have training materials you were supposed to memorize." She rubbed her temples. "Just try to stay quiet and watch what everyone else does before you act, please." Jake nodded, feeling about 2 inches tall, but staying quiet and watching didn't seem to help much. Over the next 3 days, Jake made one mistake after another. During a trade negotiation with Hytheran merchants, he spoke his opinions directly instead of using the elaborate system of hints and suggestions they preferred. The merchants buzzed angrily and ended the meeting early. When meeting with Qualith representatives, he sat in a chair that was apparently reserved for only the highest-ranking members of their species. The Qualith walked out without a word. The worst came during a meridian meditation ceremony that Jake had been required to attend. He didn't realize that the moment of silence was sacred, not just a pause in the proceedings. After about 30 seconds of quiet, Jake shifted in his seat and whispered to the human next to him, asking how long this would last. The sound of his voice in that holy silence was like a gunshot. Every meridian in the room turned to stare at him with their luminous eyes. The ceremony was ended immediately, and Jake learned later that it would have to be completely redone on another day because of his interruption. After that, the other species simply avoided Jake entirely. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped. When he approached a group, they found reasons to leave. Even the other humans on the diplomatic team started keeping their distance. Nobody wanted to be associated with the person who kept embarrassing Earth. Claire reassigned him away from all important meetings. Instead of participating in negotiations or attending ceremonies, Jake found himself in a small office in a forgotten corner of the station, organizing supply manifests and filing reports that probably nobody would ever read. He spent his days alone, staring at screens full of numbers, feeling like the biggest failure in human history. The loneliness was crushing. Jake ate his meals alone in his quarters, not wanting to face the stairs in the common dining areas. He couldn't sleep well, his mind replaying each mistake over and over again. He'd worked so hard to get this position, studied for years, graduated at the top of his class, and now he was filing paperwork because he couldn't be trusted around actual aliens. On his 5th day of isolation, Jake was walking through one of the station's main corridors when he passed a group of Velcrin. He tried to give them space, keeping his eyes down, but he still heard what they said. They were speaking in their own language, but his translator implant caught the words clearly. "The stumbling children," one of them said with a laugh. "Did you hear the human actually tried to touch Ambassador Kelthrin? Like an animal reaching for food. They are not ready," another agreed. "Too young, too crude. They should have stayed on their little planet for another 1,000 years." Jake kept walking, his fist clenched at his sides. He wanted to defend humanity, to explain that they were just different, not inferior. But what could he say? Every time he opened his mouth, he seemed to prove them right. That evening, Jake stood at an observation window staring out at the stars. Earth was out there somewhere, though too far away to see. He wondered if he should just request a transfer home. Maybe humanity's time among the stars would come later, when they had people better suited for it than him. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day of filing reports and avoiding everyone. Another day of shame. Another day of being the human who proved that his species didn't belong here. Jake had no idea that tomorrow everything would change. The next morning, Jake was sorting through inventory records when his office door chimed. Claire Patterson stood in the doorway, and she didn't look happy. Jake's stomach dropped. What had he done wrong now? "Morrison, we have a situation," Claire said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "A Kaltoran warship just requested docking permission." Jake blinked. He knew about the Kaltoran from his studies, though not much. They were rare, keeping mostly to their own territory in a distant part of the galaxy. "Is that unusual?" he asked. "Unusual?" Claire let out a harsh laugh. "Jake, the Kaltoran are the most feared species in known space. They're warriors, hunters. Their entire civilization revolves around strength and honor and the hunt. When they show up somewhere, it usually means someone is about to die or something is about to be destroyed." "Oh," Jake said quietly. "The station commander is trying to figure out why they're here, but they're not saying. They have every legal right to dock at a neutral station, so we can't refuse them." Claire looked at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Which brings me to why I'm here." Jake waited, dread building in his chest. "The Kaltoran representative needs a station liaison while he's here. Someone to show him around, explain protocols, help him find what he needs." Claire crossed her arms. "I'm assigning you." "Me?" Jake's voice cracked. "But I've already messed up with every other species here. Why would you trust me with the most dangerous aliens in the galaxy?" "Because," Claire said bluntly, "you're already a disaster. If you're going to embarrass us, better it happens with someone who's just passing through than with species we need long-term diplomatic relationships with. Consider it a chance to fail somewhere it won't matter as much." Jake felt like he'd been slapped, but he couldn't argue with her logic. "When do they arrive?" 1 hour. Report to Docking Bay 7. Try not to accidentally start a war." Claire left without another word. Jake spent the next hour researching everything he could about the Kaltoran, but there wasn't much information available. They were intensely private. What little data existed painted them as apex predators from a deadly world, with strict codes of honor and a culture built around hunting and combat. They were tall, powerful, and covered in scales. They collected trophies from their kills, and they apparently had very little patience for weakness. This was going to be a disaster. When Jake reached Docking Bay 7, a crowd had already gathered. Aliens of every species lined the upper observation galleries, all keeping a safe distance but clearly curious. Station security officers stood at attention, their hands near their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy thud that Jake felt through the floor. Warning lights flashed as the airlock cycled. Jake's mouth went dry. He wanted to run, but his legs felt frozen in place. The airlock doors opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The being that stepped through was massive. Vorthak stood nearly 8 feet tall, his body covered in obsidian black scales that seemed to absorb the light around them. His arms were thick with muscle, ending in hands that bore sharp claws. His face was angular and predatory, with golden eyes that seemed to glow with their own light. Scars crisscrossed his scales, telling stories of countless battles. He wore armor made from materials Jake didn't recognize, pieces of bone and hide that must have come from creatures he'd killed. 4 blades hung from his belt, each one looking like it could cut through steel. When Vorthak moved, it was with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Every step was deliberate, controlled, full of barely contained power. The crowd in the observation galleries pulled back even though they were already a safe distance away. Jake forced himself to walk forward. His legs felt like they were made of water, and his hands shook so badly he had to clasp them behind his back to hide it. He stopped about 10 feet from the Kaltoran, trying to remember everything he'd read about them. Don't show fear. Don't show weakness. Be direct and honest. Welcome to Zenith Prime Station, Jake said, proud that his voice only shook a little. I'm Jake Morrison. I've been assigned as your liaison during your stay here. Vorthak stopped. Those golden eyes focused on Jake with an intensity that made him feel like a small animal, being sized up by a hungry wolf. The hunter said nothing, just stared. The silence stretched out, broken only by the hum of the station's ventilation systems and Jake's own pounding heartbeat. Jake fought the urge to look away, to step back, to run. He'd already been made a fool in front of every other species on this station. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him flee in terror too, even if his knees were shaking, even if every instinct in his body was screaming at him to get away from this predator. Vorthak tilted his head slightly, like a bird examining something curious. Then slowly, deliberately, he placed one clawed hand over his heart. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture that seemed formal and significant. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rumbling like distant thunder. Brother. The word echoed through the docking bay. Jake heard gasps from the observation galleries. The security officers exchanged confused glances. Jake himself just stood there completely frozen, having no idea what had just happened. Brother? Why would the most feared warrior species in the galaxy call a human that? Why would they call him that? Jake Morrison? The failure who couldn't even shake hands properly? Vorthak straightened up, and if Jake wasn't mistaken, there was something that might have been approval in those golden eyes. You will show me this station, the hunter said. It wasn't a question. Yes, of course, Jake stammered. If you'll follow me, I can take you to your quarters first. They've been prepared according to the specifications your ship provided. Vorthak nodded once and began walking. Jake quickly moved to walk beside him, though he had to take nearly 2 steps for every one of the hunter's long strides. Behind them, Jake could hear the crowd in the observation galleries breaking into excited chatter. News of what had just happened would be all over the station within minutes. As they walked through the corridors, aliens scattered before them like fish before a shark. Jake led Vorthak through the station's main sections, explaining protocols and facilities, all while his mind raced trying to understand what had just happened. The hunter listened, occasionally nodding or asking brief questions in that deep, rumbling voice. He seemed to be studying everything, not just the station, but Jake himself. Every time Jake glanced over, those golden eyes were watching him with that same intense focus. When they finally reached the guest quarters that had been prepared, Vorthak examined the space briefly before turning back to Jake. You will eat with me tonight, the hunter said. Again, not a question. Yes, I can arrange that, Jake replied. Good. Vorthak stepped into his quarters, then paused at the doorway. You do not run from what frightens you. This is good, Jake Morrison. The door closed, leaving Jake standing alone in the corridor, more confused than he'd ever been in his life. By the time Jake returned to his quarters to clean up before dinner, his communication device was flooded with messages. Most were from other humans on the station asking what had happened. A few were from alien diplomats requesting information about the Kaltoran's intentions. Claire had sent 3 messages marked urgent. Jake ignored them all. He had no answers to give anyone because he was just as confused as they were. He changed into a fresh uniform and made his way to the restaurant that Vorthak had specified. It was one of the few establishments on the station that could accommodate both human and Kaltoran dietary needs, which apparently meant they served a lot of raw meat. Jake's stomach turned a little at the thought. Vorthak was already there, sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant. The other diners had clustered as far away from him as possible while still remaining in the room. The hunter had removed his armor, revealing the full extent of his scarred, muscular form. He wore only a simple dark vest that left his arms bare. Jake sat down across from him, and immediately a server appeared with what looked like slabs of raw meat and a dark liquid in a carved stone cup for Vorthak. For Jake, they brought something that at least resembled normal food, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. "Eat," Vorthak said, tearing into his meat with sharp teeth. "We talk." Jake picked at his food while the hunter ate. After a few minutes of silence, Vorthak spoke again. "Tell me about Earth," he said. "What would you like to know?" Jake asked. "Your history, your wars. How your species survived." It was an odd question, but Jake answered as best he could. He talked about humanity's long and often violent history, about the wars fought over resources and beliefs, about how humans had nearly destroyed themselves several times. He talked about how they'd finally managed to unite and reach for the stars, driven by curiosity and a need to find their place in a universe that was far bigger than they'd imagined. Vorthak listened intently, his golden eyes never leaving Jake's face. Occasionally he would ask a question, usually about specific conflicts or survival strategies. He seemed particularly interested in how humans had survived on Earth when they weren't the biggest or strongest creatures on their planet. "We learned to work together," Jake explained. "Humans are pack hunters. Alone we're not very impressive. But together we could take down prey much larger than ourselves. We learned to be persistent, to track animals for days until they were too exhausted to fight. We learned to adapt and use tools." "Yes," Vorthak said, and there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction. "This is what I see." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the restaurant's doors opened and a group of Velkrin entered. Jake recognized one of them immediately, a warrior named Sareth, known for his pride and his skill in combat. Sareth's silver eyes scanned the room and locked onto Jake. The Velkrin's face twisted into a sneer. Sareth walked directly to their table, flanked by two other Velkrin. He ignored Vorthak completely and focused on Jake. "Human," Sareth said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have brought shame to your species with your ignorance and your crude behavior. But worse, you have brought shame to the station by your presence." Jake felt his face flush hot, but before he could respond, Vorthak moved. The hunter didn't stand up or reach for his weapons. He simply turned his head to look at Sareth, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The human is under my protection," Vorthak said quietly. "Choose your next words carefully, Velkrin." Sareth finally seemed to notice the massive predator sitting at the table. His silver skin went a shade paler, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Then perhaps the great Terran can explain why he honors such a clumsy creature with his presence," Sareth said, trying to sound brave but not quite managing it. "Why call this child?" "Brother, because he is worthy," Vorthak replied simply. "Worthy?" Sareth laughed, though it sounded forced. "He cannot even greet an ambassador without causing offense. He interrupts sacred ceremonies. He speaks without thinking. These are not the actions of one who is worthy." Other diners were watching now, the conversation having drawn everyone's attention. Jake wanted to sink through the floor and disappear. Here it was again, all his failures laid out for everyone to see. But Vorthak stood up, his full height and presence dominating the space. "You see failure where I see the mark of a hunter," the Kaltoran said. "You see rudeness where I see directness. You see clumsiness where I see one who moves forward without fear of contact or confrontation. These are not virtues," Sareth insisted. "To prey, they are not." Vorthak agreed. "To predators, they are everything." The insult was clear. Sareth's face flushed darker silver with anger. His hand moved to the ceremonial blade at his hip. "I challenge this human," Sareth announced loudly, making sure everyone in the restaurant could hear. "Trial by combat in the arena. Let us see if this child is truly worthy of walking among civilized species, or if he should crawl back to his little planet in shame." A cold wave of fear washed over Jake. The arena was an ancient part of the station, a holdover from more lawless times. Challenges issued there were legally binding. If he refused, it would shame not just him but all of humanity. Earth's reputation in the galactic community would be destroyed before it even had a chance to grow. But if he accepted, he would almost certainly lose. Jake had basic combat training from the academy, but Sareth was a trained Velkrin warrior with decades of experience. Vorthak turned to look at Jake, his expression unreadable. "I will stand as your champion," he offered. It would have been so easy to accept, to let the powerful hunter fight in his place, to hide behind someone stronger once again. Jake had been hiding since he arrived on this station, filing paperwork in a back office, avoiding everyone who might judge him. He was tired of hiding. "No," Jake heard himself say. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Thank you, Vorthak, but no. This is my fight." Murmurs rippled through the restaurant. Sareth's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with cruel satisfaction. "Then I accept your answer, human," Sareth said. "Tomorrow at midday in the arena. Try not to embarrass your species too badly." The Velcrin turned and left, his companions following. Jake sat back down, his hands shaking. What had he just done? Vorthak settled back into his chair, and if Jake wasn't mistaken, the hunter looked pleased. "You surprise me, Jake Morrison. Most would have hidden behind a champion." "I'm tired of hiding," Jake said quietly. "I'm tired of being ashamed. If I'm going to fail, I might as well do it on my own terms." "Good," Vorthak said. He pushed his cup of dark liquid across the table to Jake. "Drink. Tonight I will tell you a story about my first hunt. Tomorrow you will need to remember it." Jake took the cup and drank, the bitter liquid burning his throat. Outside the restaurant windows, the stars wheeled past as the station rotated. In less than 24 hours, he would step into the arena. He would probably lose. He would probably get hurt badly. But at least he would face it standing up. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. After dinner, Vorthak had told him a long story about hunting a creature called a Therax on the hunter's homeworld. The beast had been enormous, armored, deadly with claws and teeth. Young Vorthak had tracked it through a jungle where the very air was poison, where every plant and animal wanted to kill him. He'd made mistakes, gotten injured, nearly died a dozen times, but he never gave up. After 3 days of pursuit, when the Therax was finally exhausted from running, Vorthak had made his kill. Jake understood the lesson. Persistence, endurance, never giving up. But understanding it and actually doing it were very different things. He gave up on sleep around 4 in the morning and went to an empty cargo bay he'd discovered during his first days on the station. It was rarely used, which meant he could practice without anyone watching. He'd brought a training staff and wore workout clothes, and for the next few hours, he went through every combat drill he could remember from the academy. He wasn't very good. He knew that. His strikes were decent but not powerful. His footwork was okay but not exceptional. He was exactly average at fighting, which meant he was nowhere near good enough to beat a trained Velcrin warrior. "Your form is adequate," a deep voice said from the doorway. Jake spun around to find Vorthak watching him. The hunter wore simple clothing and carried no weapons, but he still looked dangerous. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Jake said, breathing hard from the exercise. "You did not." Vorthak walked into the cargo bay, his footsteps silent despite his size. "You cannot sleep before the hunt." "This is natural. It's not really a hunt," Jake said. "It's a fight. One I'm going to lose." "You think in the wrong way," Vorthak said. He picked up Jake's training staff and examined it. "Tell me, Jake Morrison, what do you know of how your species hunted on your homeworld? Before your tools and weapons?" "Not much," Jake admitted. "I know we used to chase animals until they were too tired to run. Persistence hunting, they called it." "Yes." Vorthak handed the staff back. "Your species was not the strongest. Not the fastest. Not the best climbers or swimmers. But you could run forever. You could track prey for days, giving it no rest, no chance to recover. Eventually, the prey would collapse from exhaustion and the human would make the kill. That's not going to work in the arena," Jake said. "The fight will be over in minutes, not days." "Will it?" Vorthak asked. He moved to the center of the cargo bay. The Velcrin are strong, fast. They train for explosive power, for quick, decisive strikes. This is how they fight. But how long can they maintain that power? How long can they keep moving at full speed? Jake paused, thinking about it. "I don't know." "Your species evolved differently," Vorthak continued. "Your muscles, your sweat, your breathing, everything about you is designed for endurance. You can run for hours without stopping. You can keep moving when others must rest. This is your weapon, Jake Morrison. Not strength, not speed, endurance. So what do I do? Just keep running away until he gets tired?" It sounded cowardly. "You keep moving," Vorthak corrected. "Make him chase. Make him expend energy while you conserve yours. Let him swing his heavy blade while you stay just out of reach. Let him waste his power on attacks that hit nothing. And when he slows, when his muscles burn and his breathing labors, then you strike." It wasn't the honorable combat Jake had imagined. It wasn't standing toe-to-toe with an opponent and trading blows. It was more like what a wolf would do to a larger animal, wearing it down over time. That's really how humans hunted? Jake asked. It is the most terrifying form of hunting in the galaxy, Vorthak said. To be prey that cannot escape, cannot hide, cannot rest. To run and run and run, knowing the human is always behind you, always following, never stopping. To feel your strength fade while the human keeps the same steady pace. The prey dies exhausted, terrified, broken in spirit before the killing blow ever lands. The hunter's golden eyes focused on Jake. This is why I called you brother. Because I see in humans what others do not. They look at you and see weakness. I look at you and see the persistence predator. The pack hunter. The one who never stops. But I'm not a hunter, Jake protested. I'm a diplomat who can't even say hello properly. You speak directly because pack hunters must communicate quickly and clearly during the hunt, Vorthak said. You make physical contact without fear because pack hunters must work together, must touch, must coordinate. You push forward into uncomfortable situations because the persistence hunter never breaks off the pursuit, never gives up. He put a heavy hand on Jake's shoulder. The other species mock you for these things because deep down they fear them. They evolved as prey or as ambush predators who strike once and retreat. They do not understand the hunter who never retreats, who never stops, who will chase them to the ends of the world if necessary. This frightens them, so they call it rudeness. They call it clumsiness, but it is neither. Jake felt something shift inside him. All his mistakes, all the things he'd been so ashamed of. Vorthak was reframing them as something else. Not failures, but instincts. Not weaknesses, but adaptations. What if I still lose? Jake asked quietly. Then you lose, Vorthak said simply. But you will lose as a hunter, not as prey. You will lose fighting, not fleeing, and that means you will not truly lose at all. They spent the next few hours training. Vorthak showed Jake how to move efficiently, how to breathe steadily, how to pace himself. He taught Jake to think about the fight differently. Not as a battle to be won in minutes, but as a hunt that might last as long as it needed to. When morning came, Jake was exhausted but felt more prepared than he had the night before. Vorthak left him to rest, but not before saying one final thing. In my culture, before a great hunt, we say these words, "May your prey be swift, your tracking true, and your spirit unbreakable." The hunter placed his hand over his heart. Your spirit is already unbreakable, Jake Morrison. Now go and prove it to them. Jake slept for a few hours, then woke and prepared himself. He put on light protective gear, nothing heavy that would slow him down. He took a training staff as his weapon, simple and light. He ate a small meal and drank plenty of water. By the time midday arrived, Jake felt calm. Not confident exactly, but calm. He knew what he had to do. He knew he would probably get hurt. But he also knew he wasn't going to give up. As he walked toward the arena, Jake thought about Vorthak's story of hunting the Therax. 3 days of pursuit through a poisonous jungle, 3 days of pain and fear and exhaustion. But the hunter had never stopped. Jake would not stop either. The arena was older than most of the station, built centuries ago when Zenith Prime had been a frontier outpost where disputes were settled with violence rather than diplomacy. It was a large circular space with a hard floor and high walls, surrounded by viewing platforms where hundreds of spectators could watch. Today, those platforms were packed. Jake walked through the entrance tunnel and into the bright lights of the arena floor. The crowd's noise washed over him, a mixture of languages and sounds that blended into a roar. He could see humans in the crowd, including Claire, who looked worried. He could see Velkrin, Qualith, Hetheran, Meridians, and dozens of other species. They'd all come to watch the clumsy human get put in his place. Across the arena, Sareth entered through the opposite tunnel. The Velkrin warrior wore ceremonial armor that gleamed silver under the lights. He carried a plasma blade that glowed with deadly energy, and an energy shield projector on his other arm. He looked like something out of a legend, a perfect warrior ready for battle. Jake looked down at his own simple protective gear and basic training staff. He probably looked like a child playing at being a soldier. A station official stood in the center of the arena, speaking into a microphone that broadcast his voice to the crowd. He explained the rules. The fight would continue until one fighter yielded, was unable to continue, or died. Medical teams stood ready at both entrances. The fight would be monitored but not stopped unless absolutely necessary. Jake barely heard the words. He was focused on his breathing, keeping it steady and controlled. He watched Sareth studying how the Velkrin moved in his armor, how he carried his weapons. The official finished speaking and left the arena floor. A tone sounded sharp and clear. The fight began. Sareth charged immediately, his blade raised high. He was fast, covering the distance between them in seconds. Jake didn't try to block or parry. He simply moved, stepping to the side and letting Sareth's powerful strike cut through empty air. The Velcrin spun and struck again. Again, Jake moved, always just out of reach. "Stand and fight, coward," Sareth shouted, activating his energy shield and pressing forward. Jake didn't respond. He kept moving, circling, backing up, keeping Sareth chasing him. Every time the Velcrin attacked, Jake was somewhere else. The staff in Jake's hands was used only for defense, batting aside strikes when he couldn't dodge, never staying still long enough for a real fight to develop. The crowd began to murmur. This wasn't the quick, brutal victory they'd expected. Jake was bleeding from a few cuts where Sareth had gotten close, but he was still on his feet, still moving. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Sareth's attacks were still powerful, but Jake noticed they were coming slightly slower. The Velcrin's breathing was getting heavier, audible even over the crowd noise. That armor was heavy and all that aggressive attacking took energy. Jake's own breathing was steady, controlled. His legs hurt and his arms ached from holding the staff, but he'd run longer distances than this in training. He'd worked out for hours without stopping. This was just movement. This was what human bodies were built for. 15 minutes. Sareth was definitely slowing now. His strikes were becoming wilder, less controlled. He was getting frustrated, angry. Jake could see it in how the Velcrin moved, in how he overextended on his attacks, trying to end this fight that should have been over long ago. 20 minutes. Sareth stumbled slightly after a particularly hard swing. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing. Sweat poured down his silver skin. The plasma blade wavered in his grip. The crowd had gone quiet, watching in disbelief. Some were starting to understand what they were seeing. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was a hunt. And Sareth was the prey, exhausting himself while the human just kept moving at that same steady pace. Jake's vision was focused like a tunnel now. He watched Sareth's legs, saw how they were shaking. He watched the Velcrin's sword arm, saw how it was dropping lower after each attack. He could feel his own pain, his own exhaustion, but it was distant, manageable. His body was doing what it was built to do. 25 minutes. Sareth's attacks had slowed to almost normal speed. The Velcrin warrior was gasping for air, his movements becoming clumsy. The roles had reversed. Now Sareth was the one making mistakes, overextending, leaving himself open. Jake saw his opening. When Sareth swung his blade again, Jake didn't dodge. He stepped inside the attack, using his staff to redirect the blade past his shoulder. He struck hard with the end of his staff, hitting Sareth's knee. The Velcrin's leg buckled. Sareth tried to bring his shield up, but his arm was too slow, too tired. Jake struck again, hitting the Velcrin's sword hand. The plasma blade clattered to the floor. Another strike to Sareth's other knee. The Velcrin warrior fell, his legs unable to hold him up anymore. He tried to rise, failed, tried again. His body simply wouldn't respond. He collapsed onto the arena floor, chest heaving, unable to continue. The crowd was silent. Jake stood over Sareth, his staff ready, breathing hard but still standing. The station official rushed onto the floor, checked Sareth, and raised his hand toward Jake. "Victory to the human," the official announced. The silence broke into chaos. Some species cheered. Others sat in shocked disbelief. The medical team rushed in to help Sareth, whose pride was clearly more damaged than his body. Jake let the staff fall from his numb fingers. Now that the fight was over, he felt every injury, every bruise, every cut. His legs felt like water. He started to wobble. Strong hands caught him. Vorthak had entered the arena, supporting Jake before he could fall. The hunter was smiling, showing sharp teeth. "Well hunted, brother," Vorthak said. Before Jake could respond, the hunter pulled a blade from his belt. In one quick motion, Vorthak cut his own palm, drawing dark blood. Then he took Jake's hand and cut it as well. Jake was too exhausted to even flinch. Vorthak clasped their bleeding hands together, raising them high so everyone in the arena could see. "I name you brother," Vorthak's voice boomed through the space. "Before all who hunt beneath the stars, I name Jake Morrison of Earth as brother to the Kaltoran. Let all species know that humans are not prey, not children, but hunters worthy of respect. In Kaltoran culture, this was sacred. This was binding. By this ritual, Vorthak had just declared that humans deserved the same recognition that his own species commanded. The political implications would ripple across the galaxy, but Jake barely noticed. He was focused on Vorthak's golden eyes, seeing approval and respect there. "You did not give up," the hunter said quietly, meant only for Jake. "Even bleeding, even tired, you kept moving. This is what makes a hunter. This is what makes a brother." Medical staff surrounded them, checking Jake's injuries. Claire pushed through the crowd. Her expression transformed from worry to something like wonder. Other species approached cautiously, viewing Jake with new eyes. The Velcrin who had mocked him now watched in silence. Later, after his wounds were treated and he'd rested, Jake stood at an observation window looking out at the stars. Vorthak found him there. "You leave tomorrow," Jake said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my business here is complete." Vorthak stood beside him. "But we will meet again, Jake Morrison. Your species is young, but you will grow. Other species will challenge you, test you, try to break you." "And?" Jake asked. "And you will endure," Vorthak said simply. "Because that is what humans do. You are not the strongest. You are not the fastest. But you do not stop. You adapt. You persist. You hunt together. These are the marks of a true predator." Jake smiled, finally understanding. His mistakes hadn't been failures. His directness, his willingness to make contact, his tendency to push forward even when uncomfortable, these weren't flaws. They were the instincts of a persistence hunter, a pack predator, a species that had clawed its way to the top of its food chain through determination and endurance. "What will you tell your people about humans?" Jake asked. Vorthak's smile was fierce. "I will tell them the truth. That a young species walks among the stars, and the galaxy would be wise to greet them with respect rather than mockery. Because humans do not give up. They do not break. They simply keep moving forward." He placed his hand on Jake's shoulder one final time. "Hunt well, brother." The next day, Vorthak's ship departed. But everything had changed. Species that had avoided Jake now sought him out, curious about human culture and capabilities. Earth received new requests for diplomatic relations, and Jake Morrison, who had arrived as a failure and an embarrassment, had become the human who showed the galaxy what his species truly was. Not clumsy children stumbling among the stars, but hunters who had found their pack and would never stop pursuing their place in the universe.